Zena Kazeme is a refugee rights activist, spoken word artist, and freelance radio broadcaster on BBC Radio 2. She also sits on the board of trustees at Amos Trust, a grassroots organisation advocating for human rights and civil justice in Palestine. She draws on her personal experiences as a refugee as inspiration for her poetry and work. She has hosted numerous poetry nights, performed at a number of festivals, headlined at poetry events, and sat on panels on refugee rights across the UK. She is currently working on a collection of poetry collated written by women in Gaza who participated in a Healing Through Poetry workshop she facilitated, and she runs a refugee settlement service in London where she resides. So please enjoy the talk, and please stay behind and enjoy the rest of the festival. There's different workshops happening, and there's going to be an open mic performance this evening, so if you're around, please stay. I'll hand over.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much everyone for coming here. Assalamu alaikum. I just want to sort of preface this talk by saying that I'm in no way a Rumi scholar. I'm just a huge Rumi nerd. I'm of Iranian descent. I was born and raised in Iran. I grew up reading and learning about Rumi from a young age, and over the last 10 years or so I've been studying a little bit more about him, and recently completed a course in Persian poetry, and Rumi was very much the focal point of that course. So I'm in no way a Rumi scholar or a religious scholar, so please forgive me if I say anything that you know to be different, and I'm happy for anybody to correct me in the end. You can come and tell me if I've said something that you believe is different. So today's topic is the Islamic legacy of Maulana, and you'll notice that I'll be referring to Rumi as Maulana because that is how I was raised to refer to him. In the Persian-speaking world, we normally don't use the word Rumi to refer to him. The subject of our talk today is always referred to as Maulana, and that's how I hope to be referring to him for most of the duration of this talk. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, who was Maulana? The areas I want to cover today are where Maulana is from, a little bit of a brief background about who he was, and then I want to talk about how he met Shams Tabrizi, who was the man who inspired him to become a poet, who opened his heart to go from a cleric and a scholar into a mystic poet and a Sufi sage. And then I want to touch a little bit about the Masnavi and Matnavi, which is his main collection of poetry, his longest collection of poetry. And I want to share some stories from the Masnavi and a little bit of poetry from there. And then I want to talk about how Rumi arrived to the West and have a little rant about the modern translations of Rumi in the English language and his legacy and what we can do to preserve that legacy and reclaim him. So his name is in full Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi, or Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi, and it's important to note that Balkhi and Rumi are both prefixes known as nisba, and they're just simply attached to the end of his name to denote where he's from. So, as I said, we wouldn't refer to him in the Persian-speaking world as Rumi because Rumi simply means Roman, of Roman descent. Of course, he wasn't Roman. He was from most people believe he was from Balkh, that he was born in Balkh, which is modern-day Afghanistan, and that he had Iranian ancestry, or what we now consider to be Iran, Persian ancestry. So Rumi and Balkhi are interchangeable, but of course the Western world knows him best as Rumi. So the fact that we refer to him as simply Maulana is an interesting little thing to note. Maulana in Farsi simply means our master, and for somebody to have a title like that turned into a noun for them really tells you, how far he's made it. If you refer to Maulana in Iran, everybody knows who you're referring to. Nobody's going to think you're talking about your master. Everybody knows who Maulana is, and that kind of tells you the kind of space he holds in the Muslim psyche. So the point of where he's from originally is somewhat a point of contention. Arabs, Iranians, Turks, Tajikistanis, Afghanis, everybody wants to claim Rumi and say he's from our country, understandably so. But we have to sort of keep in mind that the ideas that we have of borders and nationality and, identity are very different to what they were in the 13th century when he was around. And what we consider now to be Iranian or Afghan or Tajikistani is not reflective of the society that he was born in. So it's impossible to say, where he was from in the modern context, but we know that he is most likely from Balkh, and that is in modern-day Afghanistan. But what the scholars would call it is Greater Iran. So that whole region that's in green is considered, historically was known as now they call it Greater Iran. So he really traveled across that whole region, and it's really hard to pinpoint exactly where he was from there. So he was born to an Iranic family, and Iranic is, I'm not saying Iranian, I'm saying Iranic because Iranic is an umbrella term that refers to, most of that green region. And he traveled across lots of different countries in his lifetime. In fact, Rumi was a refugee. When he lived in Balkh, the Mongol invasion led to his family to flee violence and to flee war. And they made their way from Balkh to Nishapur and then to Baghdad, where he lived for a long time and was influenced by the great scholars that lived in Baghdad at the time. And then from there, they moved to Medina and Mecca. They did the pilgrimage, and at that time, a lot of people, when they went for pilgrimage, they would stay for a while in Medina, they would stay for a while in Mecca, because it was a long journey, and it was, difficult to kind of just go for 10 days and leave as we do now. From there, he moved to Damascus to study religion, to study theology. And in the end, he ended up in Turkey, where he's now buried, in Konya. So he lived in Anatolia for a while, and then he ended his journey in Konya. And it's believed that he met Shams Tabrizi in Konya. So just one thing to note, the fact that Maulana was a refugee tells us a lot about his poetry, because in his poetry he refers a lot to separation and to the homeland and to yearning and to wanting a sense of home. And I think it informs his conclusion that home is not a place on a map. Home is ultimately, where you reside at the end of your life, where you end up in the other realm. Next slide, please. So this is the meeting of Shams Tabrizi and Maulana in this beautiful miniature painting. So Shams Tabrizi was a dervish, as we would refer to him in today's term. He was a traveling scholar. He was much older than Rumi. Rumi at the time was about 37. Shams was about 60 years old. And as some of you may have read the 40 Rules of Love by Alif Shafaq, you'll know that, and I'll get back to that book later, but you'll know that his father was a scholar, and he was a scholar himself who was a Hafiz of the Quran and a theologian, and he very much studied the Sharia, he studied fiqh, he studied the Hanafi madhab, and he was a seminary teacher. So for a long time, he was known simply as a scholar of religion. It was when he met Shams Tabrizi that he became a poet. It was at that point that, the way that we would perhaps phrase it is the aql and the heart met. So the mind and the heart were combined in that point, and it led to the opening of this beautiful Sufi path that we have now, and his wonderful legacy and all the poetry. So there's a bit of controversy about the nature of the relationship between the master and the student, Rumi and Shams. And I think this is something that we should sort of touch on a little bit, because it's important to kind of understand where these contradictions or points of contention come from. The relationship, I mean, modern Orientalist Western thinkers have interpreted the relationship as a romantic one. And that's because when you strip Rumi's poetry of its divine value, of its religiosity, of its Islam, of its God, then what you have is a Western interpretation of love, which is devoid of religion, devoid of spirituality. And that can be interpreted as romantic. And I can understand why. I mean, this goes back to really bad interpretations that I'll get back to later. But this just goes back to really bad interpretations of Maulana's work. And for that reason, there's this idea that there was potentially a romantic relationship between Maulana and Shams Tabrizi. Every Persian-speaking scholar that is well-renowned in the Persian-speaking world who's read Rumi's work in its original text has refuted these claims. But it's difficult for, I guess, the Western culture to kind of understand the way that a relationship between a teacher and a student can exist in that part of the world. It's very normal for a student and a master to have a deep, loving relationship and to speak about each other in the way that Maulana speaks about Shams. And in a culture that's very comfortable with affection and expressing love, that kind of language is very normal. Farsi is a very flowery language. Just on a daily basis, you'll end up calling somebody a flower and you'll end up calling somebody a bird and whatnot, because it is a very poetic language in its nature. So it's understandable that it's been misconstrued in that way by the modern Western Orientalist gaze, but it's not acceptable. And this is part of having to reclaim the narrative of Maulana's life and the narrative of the Masnavi. So although we're not sure exactly how or where Rumi and Shams met, we know that Maulana was forever changed by the meeting. I don't want to get too much bogged up about where they met exactly, how they met, whether he was invited to Konya, whether they happened to meet in Konya, as Alif Shafaq likes to put in her story, the romanticized version of him riding in on a horse and Shams Tabrizi just happening to be there because he had a feeling that Maulana was going to be there. I guess that's, Allahu Alam. But we know that Maulana was forever changed by that meeting. His life was never the same again. And at the moment when Shams disappears, we don't know whether he was killed, whether he died, whether he went into occultation, some people would say. The moment that Shams is gone from Maulana's life, his life is not the same again. And that's where the poetry comes from. That heartbreak is what sort of opens him to express all this beautiful poetry that he leaves behind for us. Next, please. Okay, so the Masnavi. As you can see on the left, this is a beautiful Tazhib version of the Masnavi. It's a lovely illuminated script, similar to the old manuscripts of the Quran. And there's a lot of correlation between the Quran and the Masnavi. Because Maulana was a hafidh of the Quran, and he was somebody who studied theology very deeply and was a scholar of Islam. The entire Masnavi draws on surahs from the Quran and stories from the Quran and characters of the Quran and metaphors of the Quran. So there's a lot of correlation between the Masnavi and Quran. And in some parts of the Persian-speaking world, the Masnavi is actually known as the Persian Quran, but it's not really accepted to say that anymore. So there are 6 volumes to this book, and it's interesting that we refer to it simply as the Masnavi. Just like we refer to Maulana simply as Maulana because he's become the Maulana. Masnavi in Farsi just simply means, and in Arabic, it simply just means a long poem, a very, very long poem. But if you go into any bookshop in Iran or in the Persian-speaking world and you say, can I have a copy of the Masnavi, people will hand you this copy. Nobody's going to hand you anything else because that is how influential Maulana is. And there's actually, I was reading something that was written by a researcher, I can't remember his name, which is really bad, but there's somebody in the US who goes around the Middle East and he counts, his job is to count manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts, and he sort of keeps count of what gets sold and whatnot. And he said that across the Muslim world in quotations, across the Muslim world, so let's say between Bosnia and Bangladesh, so across the board. In terms of sales of handwritten manuscripts, the Masnavi is only beaten by the Quran. So after the Quran, the Masnavi is the most sold handwritten manuscript. So if you imagine people were handwriting this over and over and over again, just as they did with the Quran, then you understand the impact, the legacy that Maulana had. And it's definitely the case that Maulana is taught, and the Masnavi, the poems from the Masnavi are taught in schools in Iran. I was taught the story of Moses and the shepherd, which we'll get to at some point, in primary school, and it's just part and parcel of the culture, of the everyday culture in Iran. And I'm sure also in Turkey. So the English translation that I'm going to be drawing on will be from Jawed Mujaddadi's book. I think that is the best, most reliable translation because it stays true to the rhyme of the poems. It stays true to the text, unlike others. It does not erase Islam. It does not erase the Prophet ﷺ. It does not erase, ayahs of the Quran and hadiths. It stays very true, and at the same time, it rhymes. So it's a pleasure to read. I just want to talk a little, I don't want to go too much into this because I'll get into this properly later, but I just want to talk about the English translations of the problems with modern understandings of the Masnavi. The problem that we have with the modern understanding of the Masnavi is that when it comes to understanding him, there's usually two voices that are trying to drown out the message of Maulana in the modern world. On the one hand, you have Orientalists who extract God and Islam from Maulana's work, and on the other hand, you have extremists or takfiris who do exactly the same thing. They try to claim that the tradition of love doesn't belong in Islam, and so Maulana's work is not Islamic. So you have, ironically, they are two sides of the same coin, where one is saying that Maulana is not a Muslim because his poetry is about love, it's about a different kind of love, it's not about God. And then you have the other side who are saying Maulana is not a Muslim because he's just talking about love, and you can't talk about that kind of stuff and call yourself a Muslim scholar. So these two voices are kind of drowning out the real message of Maulana in the modern world. And that makes it very difficult for people who are trying to actually learn about Maulana's work, because when you go on the internet, all you're going to find is ridiculous memes and little squares on Instagram with nature in the background and something like "give me more wine until I'm satisfied" or some rubbish like that has nothing to do with Maulana's message. So the beginning of the Masnavi, after the Bismillah, it says, this book is about usul al-din. And although I've just, said Jawed Mujaddadi's translation is the best, and I do believe it is, he translates it as the roots of the main tenets of theology, and I kind of disagree with that. I think what Maulana is trying to say is that this is the root of the root of the root of faith. So he's calling the Masnavi, his work, the root of the root of the root of faith. And what he's saying is that this is the core, his message of love, of divine love. This is the core of faith. It's simply a tree metaphor. So whenever Muslim scholars want to use a metaphor, they always turn to roots and branches. But there's a reason for that, because what do roots do? Roots ground you. When the inevitable storms of life come along, or the inevitable winds come, roots are what ground us to the earth. It's what keeps us upright, and it's what sustains us as well. So when he says it's the root, he's saying it's what grounds and sustains, and what grounds and sustains faith. So if you hang on to the external elements of faith, you do all your prayers, but it's done without presence. You haven't nurtured the roots. You haven't looked at the essence, which is the divine love, which is what keeps you grounded, what keeps faith going. So then in the next line, after the Basmala, and after he says this is the usul ad-din, in the next line he plays with a theme that's going to stay with us for the rest of the Masnavi. He says, fi kashf asrar al-usul wal-yaqeen. So in the unveiling of the secrets of faith and yaqeen, contentment, I would say. So the word kashf here means unveiling, but not unveiling in the physical sense of a woman unveiling her hijab, as Orientalists might. Sorry, I'm going to refer a lot to Orientalists here, but as Orientalists might interpret it as, it's more compared to, and this theme kind of stays throughout the Masnavi, of the unveiling of a bride, of the unveiling of something beautiful, and it's about what unveils us from God, rather than physical veils like hijab. And asrar here is the plural of the word sir, which means secret. But it also refers to, in the Old Arabic, the innermost layer of the heart. The innermost layer of the heart is also, in Old Arabic, was also known as sir. So the greatest secret of the cosmos is the heart of humanity. That's really what Maulana is saying in that sentence. And it comes back to this understanding that we have in Islam, that the secret was offered to the mountains and the heavens, and they weren't strong enough to bear it, but humanity took it on. So the same heart that Maulana is, that Maulana says in his poetry, he says as the mouthpiece of God, he says, I, as in I, God, cannot fit into the heavens and the earth, but the heart of my servant suffices me. So he's really saying that the heart is where the secrets of the divine, the secrets of the world are contained within the heart of the human being. And that's where God resides. So the heavens and the mountains could not bear that love, but the heart of the human being could. And that's where you have to seek God. That's the idea. So I want to read you a small story from the beginning of the Masnavi, just to give you an idea of how the narrative of the Masnavi kind of changes throughout the book. One of the first stories in the Masnavi is called The Shallow Interpretation of the Fly. And when you hear it, you're going to realize that the sort of English understanding we have of Maulana's work, which is all love and hearts and romance, is really not the case. Sometimes he's a bit bizarre. Sometimes he draws on metaphors that are a little bit humorous or odd, and this is definitely one of them. So the story is called The Shallow Interpretation of the Fly, and I'll read you a little excerpt from Mujaddadi's translation. But it's basically the story of a fly riding on a piece of straw on a stream, if you'll excuse me, of donkey's urine. So the fly believes it's sailing the ocean and it's the captain of a boat. But Maulana is using this metaphor for how narrow interpretation of religion can turn us into the fly. So losing perspective and believing the limited knowledge that we have is everything turns us into a little fly on a straw sailing in donkey's urine. So the excerpt from Mujaddadi's translation says, "It thought a single drop could stretch so far, unable to observe things as they are. Its world stretched out as far as it could view. Small eyes count as a sea a drop or two. Narrow interpretations are like this fly. With straw and urine, they all falsify. If you stop reading from your own small view, the phoenix will grant kingdoms then to you. Still, those who've worked this out aren't really flies. Spirits don't correspond to body size. So the phoenix here, again, is another metaphor that Rumi uses. The phoenix is a metaphor that's used in a lot of Sufi work, like Farid Attar's Conference of the Birds. The phoenix refers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as you can see, Maulana had a bit of a sense of humor, and he wasn't afraid of amusing and shocking and disturbing the reader to drive an important message home. And of course, the metaphor of the fly is also used in the Quran, where God challenges man to create something even as small as a fly, which in itself is a nuanced and layered statement. So it's important to keep in mind that within the Mevlevi tradition, which is the tariqah that is the legacy of Maulana, which remains alive in Turkey, they teach you that it should take you 40 years to discuss just the first 80 lines of the book of the Masnavi. So we're trying to condense that into 1 hour, 40 years of work, and it's just a reminder of how little I can give in such a short space of time. I'm going to share another short story with you guys from book 1, and that's of the maiden and the king. So there's a king, and he falls in love with a maiden, and he finds out that she's sick. And so he calls a doctor to try and figure out what her disease is. And like any Muslim doctor or Greek doctor of the time, the way that they would diagnose people is by checking their pulse. And it turned out that after, obviously this is fictional and it's part of a story, and it turns out after he checks her pulse and diagnoses her, he says to her, I know what your ailment is, it's love sickness. So health at the time was determined through the balance of humours. So there's this idea that there are foods that are cold in nature and there are foods that are hot in nature. And this idea still kind of has survived in Iran. My aunties used to never let us eat things like olives on their own because they're very hot in nature, and they would say, you have to have some like pomegranate molasses on it, or you have to have it with like some yogurt or something. They still don't eat fish with yogurt for some reason. I don't know which one's hot and which one's cold, but some people are nodding. Yeah, so this idea still exists. I don't know how true it is. I'm not a medic, but it was this idea that there's things hot in nature and cold in nature, and that's how they would sort of cure ailments. And so it's said that love is the only ailment that is also the cure. So it's both the ailment and the cure. So in a way, when you're sick, you're also cured, and you're also sick, and there's just no way out of it. It is. Maulana, basically, what he's saying is that since love is considered the one disease where the cure is the cause, and it's the only thing that is, similar, as in there is no opposite to love. There is no, similar to God, we know God because he has no opposite. Everything comes in opposites. You know good because you've known bad. You know light because you've seen darkness. You know hunger because you've been fed. Whereas God has no opposite. God is just. And love is the same. He's saying love is both the cure and the cause. So there's no way of, it has no opposite. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. And now I just want to share with you guys what's the most famous or popular and well-loved story or poem from the Masnavi, from the first book, which is called Song of the Flute. I believe it's from the first book. It may be from the second book. Don't quote the first book. Somebody's correcting me. Thank you. It's good to have you in the front. So the Song of the Reed Flute is in the middle of the first chapter. I've actually got it in my notes. And it starts off by saying, now listen to this reed flute's deep lament about the heartbreak being apart has meant. So Maulana calls himself the reed flute, and I don't know if anybody's heard the music of the reed flute, I'm sure you have, or the nais, it's called in Arabic, but it's a very mournful, sorrowful sound. It laments and it complains of separation, that's the idea. And it's not, Maulana says that it complains and laments the separations, plural. He says jodayi ha. And that's because he sort of acknowledges that we suffer from multiple types of separation. So there's existential separation, which is, being separated from a loved one, whether they're no longer in this world or they're, in Manchester or wherever. And there is the separation from the homeland. So for people who have been, have had to leave their homes, there's that kind of separation, that kind of being far from home. And then there is the separation, of course, from God. And just on the point about the separation from the homeland, there is a hadith that's attributed to the Prophet, which says, Hubbul watan min al-iman, which means that a love of the homeland is part of faith. Some people say that it's not a very strong hadith, but it's one that nationalists love to use. And Maulana says the homeland the Prophet is talking about in this hadith is not Iran or England or Turkey. The homeland is the other realm homeland. It's the homeland that reunites us with the beloved, the one that guarantees a reunion that fulfills. So how do you make a reed flute? I've inserted a little picture of a reed flute there, if you can see it. According to Rumi, you go to a place called Neyestan, which stan, is added to the end of names to denote a country. So he says you go to Neyestan, which is the country or the place of the land of the reeds. And the land of the reeds, you cut the reed. So there's an act of violence and pain and separation involved. Then you bring them home, you empty out the inside, you make it hollow, just as we have to be made hollow in order for us to receive. And then you have to be willing to let go of everything that blocks you inside. So just as the reed is emptied, we have to be emptied. We have to be made hollow. We have to accept that we have to be emptied in order for us to be receptacles of God's love. Then you take a metal rod and put it in the fire until it's white hot, and you press it inside and against the reed 6 times on one side and once in the back. As you can see, there's 6 holes there. And then you breathe music through it. So Maulana compares this to the divine breath that's breathed into our souls, into us. And the sad sound that the flute makes is the sound that he makes. That's why he compares himself to the reed flute, because he says, that's me. I make that sound, from the separation from the beloved, when I was plucked from Neyestan. So he starts the Masnavi by talking about homesickness and lamentation and separation. And there's a narrative arc in the first chapter of the Masnavi. He starts by complaining about his separation. So the stories start off by being very much about the nafs, being very much about, problems and difficulties. And the king who was in love with the lovesick maiden ends up, that story ends up with the king killing the maiden's lover. The stories at the beginning are very much of couples arguing and lots of distress. And as you keep reading, you start to see that what Maulana is, what the Masnavi is, it's a map of the spiritual journey that we're intended to go on as followers of the path, as Muslims. And he starts out raw, as he calls it, in the primal state. And in Farsi he says, حاصل عمرم سخن بیش نیست، خام بودم، پخته شدم، سوختم. Meaning the whole of my life is summed up in these 3 words. I used to be raw, then I was cooked, now I'm on fire. So that's kind of the narrative arc of the first chapter of the Masnavi as well, in that you start out with stories very much about the nafs, very raw, very primal, and then it cooks, and then by the end it's on fire. And I really like that metaphor myself. So the stories start from a place of rawness, and they end up with a story of the man who spits in the face of Imam Ali alayhi salam, which is one of my favorite stories in the Masnavi. So the story goes like this. There's a warrior who's defeated by Imam Ali in a battle, and he's disgusted by the fact that this young man Ali has beat him, and so out of disgust he spits in his face. And Maulana in this poem calls Imam Ali the pride of the Prophet. So he says this warrior spits into the face of the pride of the Prophet. And Imam Ali already has his sword out, ready to kill him. But in that moment he puts his sword back in the sheath and walks away. So then Imam Ali and this warrior have a 20-page dialogue, apparently in the middle of a battle, which can only happen in a Muslim story. And so the warrior starts talking to Imam Ali and says, "Lion of God, you had me defeated. Why didn't you finish the job?" And Imam Ali's response is, "Up until that moment, everything I did was for the sake of God. If I had killed you, it would have been for the sake of God. But then you spat at me, and I got angry. If I kill you now, I would be killing you for my own ego." And he has this great pun that Rumi uses in the poem. He says, "I am a kuh, not a car," which means I'm a mountain, not a piece of straw. So he's saying that I am a mountain of a soul. I'm not a piece of straw. I'm a mountain. I don't get swayed that easily by the winds of desire or temptation or anger. I'm not a piece of straw that sways. So it kind of tells us that it's not that Imam Ali had no anger. He didn't feel anger. He was just like this pure person who was just always really super calm. It's that he was in charge of his nafs. He was able to divert it and steer it in the way that he pleased. And that's kind of the whole point. And then there's another story that I thought was really great near the end of the book as well, called The Story of the Cross-Eyed Boy. Which, of course, we recognize now that this is a very much an ableist narrative, and we know that speaking in a mocking tone about disabilities is not cool, but let's meet Maulana where he was. So it's a story about a teacher that tells a boy to go and fetch a bottle, and the boy is cross-eyed. And the kid goes and gets the bottle to get the bottle, but because he's cross-eyed, he sees more than one. And so he says to him, which one do you want me to get? I don't know which one to get. So then Maulana works that story over and over again, because guess who's the cross-eyed boy? It's us. So there's one God, one humanity, one guidance, but we insist on seeing everything in multiples, and we refuse to see the oneness of humanity. And how do we solve the problem of being cross-eyed? I know, again, this is very ableist language. You uncross your eyes. You simply learn to see with clarity, which I know doesn't make much sense in the modern context, but that's the analogy that Maulana went with. And uncrossing is part of what the Masnavi is supposed to help us do. It's supposed to help us see past the external and see the truth, and to see the inner reality. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit about the Quranic influences in the Masnavi. So we've talked about the idea that the characters in the Masnavi, a lot of them, the fly and the cross-eyed boy, are really metaphors for us. So they're really inside us. And Maulana puts across the point that it can be said that this is the same for the characters in the Quran. So obviously we have to be aware of what we're saying here, and Maulana isn't suggesting that the Quran is just, all the characters are fictional or that they're metaphors. And of course he did believe in all the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran and all the people that are mentioned in the Quran. But what he's saying is, you've read the story of Moses and the Pharaoh. So who's the Pharaoh of your soul? What in you calls out like the Pharaoh, indeed I am God? That's what he's saying. He's saying, within you there is Moses, within you there is the Pharaoh. And that's how you're supposed to read the Quran, not just as a bunch of stories. Another Quranic story that Maulana talks about is the beloved, well-known story of the Miraj, which is the central spiritual experience of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And the angel Gabriel accompanies the Prophet to the threshold of God and then stops. So I included this image because I just think it's such a beautiful beautiful depiction of that story. But as you can see here, the Prophet is like surrounded by this light, almost like he's on fire. And the Prophet says to Angel Gabriel, "You've come with me, from Mecca to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem through all the levels of heaven. Now that we've reached God, why do you abandon me? Why do you stop?" And Gabriel says, "If I take a step as wide as a single one of my feathers, all of my wings will burn up from the intensity of God's love." So he says, "I can't enter with you. You have to go alone." And it's a well-known story, but if you look at what Maulana is doing with it, it's really interesting. So in the classical Islamic thought, angels correspond with aql, the intellect. So angels are the ones who are rational. And you need rationality, of course. You need your aql to get, from here to the threshold of God. But you can't go in to meet God with your aql. The only way that you can enter God is through love. And what Maulana says is the Prophet to Maulana is love. So the only way that you can enter love is through love. And so only the Prophet can enter God. How do we reach that love? How do we learn that love? How do we embrace that love? It's through the Prophet ﷺ. That's for Maulana. So for all the Orientalist translators that like to remove the mention of the Prophet in Maulana's poetry, this is, sticking it to them. This is what he's saying. He's saying, love is the way, and for me, that driving force of love is the Prophet ﷺ. So Maulana says the Prophet is that divine love and affection that is immortal. The Prophet represents the divine love for the cosmos. And so Sufis believe that it's for the sake of the Prophet that God creates, and it's because the Prophet is love and God is love that love can enter into love. So here you have the interconnectedness of love and intellect, the angel and the Prophet. And that's what creates this beautiful spiritual path that we're hoping to learn from. And then Maulana says nafs is hell. So he says nafs is not necessarily this place. Hell is not necessarily this other place that you go to. Of course, he doesn't believe in hell and heaven as it's described in the Quran. But he says nafs is also hell. Nafs is the hell that's here. So hell is something that we create when we hate or when we act on anger. If you think about when you're, particularly angry, or you're moments away from punching somebody in the face, you get really hot under the collar. You feel really, really hot. You feel physically hot. And he says that's the fire. That's hell. So what's heaven? Is it silk cushions and shade and beautiful companions? That's not how Maulana and most of the Sufi mystics, who, are part of what we call mazhab-e-ishq, which is the radical love tradition, or the path of radical love, thought of heaven. The Sufis or Maulana, the way that they would approach heaven is by thinking of, if you think about the ayah that we normally recite at funerals, Ya ayyatuhan nafs al-mutma'inna irji'i ila rabbiki radiyatan mardiyah fadkhuli fi ibadi wadkhuli jannati. Oh, content soul, return to your Lord, pleased with him as he is pleased with you, and enter amongst my worshippers or my servants, and enter my paradise. In Arabic, Maulana, he was the master of Persian and Arabic, and the way that he reads it, he says, when he says you enter into my servants, he's not talking about a physical place. He's saying when you enter amongst them, when you become one with my servants, when you learn to connect with each other, when you become one with humanity, that's when you enter paradise. That's when you enter heaven. So he's saying that the nafs can be hell, and heaven is connectedness. It's the oneness with my servants. And that's how he interprets that ayah. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to shift gears a little bit and air out some grievances that I've been referring to throughout this presentation about modern translations of Maulana's work and the Western perception of Maulana. So we've obviously seen a huge rise in interest in Maulana's work over the last 2 decades. That's the reason you're all gathered here, I assume. Unfortunately, many Westerners are under the impression that Maulana wasn't Muslim. I mean, if you Google Maulana or you Google Maulana, you're going to get a restaurant in Hammersmith. But if you Google Rumi, one of the first questions that kind of come up as suggested questions is, what was Rumi's religion, or was Rumi Muslim? Or, people still don't. There's a lot of people who don't think Rumi was Muslim. And I remember watching this really rubbish rom-com one time about Valentine's Day, I think, and Ashton Kutcher was in it, and they were talking about Maulana Rumi, and they were just like, oh, it's Valentine's Day, or have you read the poetry of the poet of love? And I was like, that's not what he's talking about. It has nothing to do with Valentine's Day. But it kind of shows you just how much these interpretations have been skewed, unfortunately. So in the way that the Western Orientalist kind of has presented Maulana and presented the Masnavi to us, is as if Maulana's Muslimness is completely irrelevant. So the writer and the Persian translator, Muhammad Ali Mujarradi, who is also my teacher, I was on one of his courses, he's better known as Shaykh Jalaluddin on Twitter, or Persian Poetics on Instagram. There's a lot of nods. Yes, he's really good. He says, in order to understand why the West perceives Maulana the way that it does, we have to go back 3 centuries. So Western interaction with Sufism obviously began in the Victorian era, where British Orientalists, many of whom were living in Iran and India during colonialism, produced the first completed English translation of Persian Sufi texts. So not just the Masnavi, but Conference of the Birds and Divan Hafiz and lots of other pieces of work. And at the time, Persian was the literary lingua franca of the Muslim world. And a tradition that ended with the British control of schooling policy in their colonies. So after the British invaded and colonized those parts of the world, Persian was no longer taught. It wasn't the main language anymore. So traditional methods were replaced with Western-style education, and Persian was replaced with English, and it severed people from thousands of years of heritage. So after an initial bout of interest, the West largely, after the Victorian era, the West largely forgot about Persian poetry until the 60s, when we had the hippie movement and free love. And the baby boomers basically were rebelling against suburban cookie cutter post-war America, and wanted sort of some kind of meaning for their materialistic existence. So they looked to the East, and there was a rise in yoga and gurus, and one of the things that they imported was Maulana's work and Persian poetry and Sufism. So the West, as we know, plundered and enslaved the East to build the greatest material excess known to man. And one of the biggest things that were stolen was our identity, our spiritual identity. And it's offensive. Some of the translations of Maulana's work that are out there today are deeply, deeply offensive. For me as an Iranian, when I read them, I'm just like, Coleman Barks is tripping. Like, what was he talking about? Has nothing to do with the things I grew up reading or the things that I know of Maulana. So, how did we reach where we are now? How did Maulana reach us now? The main interpreter, and I don't want to say translator, I'll say interpreter, because he didn't really translate. He just interpreted. The main interpreter of Maulana's work is Mr. Coleman Barks, who's released lots of books and profited a great deal from Maulana's work. And what he did is, he can't read Persian, he's not a Farsi speaker. He didn't consult with many Persian speakers when he was interpreting Maulana's work. What he did was he took the Victorian translations, which were already awful, and reinterpreted them for a modern audience. And in that, he erased a lot. So there's a quote up there where he says, "I used to memorize Bible verses, and I know the New Testament more than I know the Quran. And the Quran is hard to read. Who cares? Let's not bother with the Quran. Let's just go and translate it how we feel according to our feelings." And another quote up there, he says, "I take the Islam out of it," when he's talking about how he interprets Maulana's work. He says, "Yeah, the fundamentalists, or people who think there is one particular revelation, scold me for this." So then he puts the burden on us, saying anybody who questions me, yeah, they're just fundamentalists. They just, care too much about, it's all about Allah and the Prophet for them. So if you have any of the books that are in the picture up there, I really suggest you go home and burn them, or use them to prop up like a dodgy chair, because it's not even worth donating to a charity shop. Let's not keep them circulating. Let's just get rid of them. So it's very disturbing the way that things have gone. The thing that really bothers me is the fact that Maulana is considered the best-selling poet in the US, and people have really, taken on these books and have, it's a lot of people will come to you and say, yeah, Rumi transformed my life after my breakup, and it's sad to see that something like this has finally reached the West, but has reached us in completely the wrong way. And I don't want to pick on people who read these books, because if I'm honest, when I was younger, one of the first books that I had of Maulana's in English was The Essential Rumi by Coleman Barks. So, I'm guilty of it myself, but it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. So this translator, Coleman Barks, he emerged at a time when Sufism was like the new toy in America. And as I said, he kind of paraphrased and changed what he liked. But he very specifically took out references to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he claims it's because, the one thing I'll give him is that he's very open about his misdeeds. But what he's done is that he's taken references to Islamic figures in the Masnavi, but he's kept things about Jesus and Joseph. So it's not that he wants to just make it a secular text, it's that he just doesn't want Islam in there. Which is what disturbs me more than anything. So a reader of Barks's translation might not realize, as we said, that Rumi's Muslim at all, because it's completely ripped out of context. The other thing that I really don't enjoy about his translations is that it's an American free verse. There's no rhyme. He doesn't try to even rhyme any of that. He just basically just doesn't want to tire himself at all. He just takes that and goes, this is how I feel it means, and then just puts it down on paper and makes no effort. And it's kind of a spiritual colonialism, I would say. And Amit Safi, one of the really great Sufi scholars in America, also calls it a spiritual colonialism. And it's no different to appropriation of culture. So we get offended if somebody wears our traditional clothes as Halloween costume, but we're not offended that somebody has basically appropriated our our Islamic tradition, our poet. We have to claim Rumi in order for us to say that, that's appropriation. If we don't know Rumi's work, if we don't know who Maulana is, then we can't pick on Coleman Barks or anybody that reads Coleman Barks. So some Muslims do defend Coleman Barks. They say that through his renderings, though his renderings aren't true to the original, he's very forthcoming with his methodology, and he's opened up a new audience to Maulana's writing, and that his writing is an approachable introduction into the world of Sufism. Personally, I don't buy into this idea. I don't like the idea of us being thankful to somebody who has appropriated and misrepresented the works of a Muslim scholar and made profit from it. It doesn't sit right with me. And there are countless Muslim translators who have studied Persian, or native Persian speakers who've done their due diligence, spent thousands of hours translating work and re-rendering it, and taking into account rhyme and meter and accuracy. People like Jawad Mujaddadi and others who've done a wonderful work, but we praise Coleman Barks for some reason, and he's the best-selling one. So I think there's a lot of reflection to be done there.
White American guy.
Pardon?
He's a white American guy.
Well, I don't want to say it in such literal terms, but yes. Yeah. So, other than the misinterpretation and the mistranslation and the appropriation of Maulana's poetry, what we've seen in the last few years is complete fabrication of Maulana's poetry. So quotes attributed to him that turn out to be song lyrics, or Leonard Cohen, writing, and that's the kind of stuff that is almost worse than Coleman Barks' mistranslations. And yeah, this picture right here is something that I recently saw that really bothered me. This is a poster in Farsi with the face of Coleman Barks. This is how he looks, in case you guys want to take it in so that you can avoid him. He was invited to a university in Iran and offered an honorary doctorate. And that doesn't sit well with me at all. It makes me really uncomfortable, because it just reminds me of how we accept breadcrumbs, It's like we're just so grateful that this man from the West came and glanced upon us, And it's like, come and have an honorary doctorate, even though there's Iranians who've been working really hard and translating this work accurately. Let's give this man an honorary doctorate. So that's really sad. The other thing that is very upsetting to see, and I'm not going to moan too much, but now I see sort of Farsi translations of Coleman Barks' work attributed to Rumi. So we've come full circle in the worst way. So Rumi writes poetry in Farsi, Coleman Barks misinterprets it, mistranslates it. Young Iranians come and read that, translate it back to Farsi to make it look authentic, and then share it and circulate it. So it's just, awful. So let's have a little look at Rumi in pop culture. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So some examples of Rumi showing up in pop culture. He was in Madonna's song, I think it was called Bittersweet, that's it. And she used Deepak Chopra's mistranslation, which was even worse than Coleman Barks, if you could imagine. Next slide, please. And this is Chris Martin from Coldplay looking very pleased with himself after he said his album was inspired by Rumi, which he wrote following his breakup, and which gave rise to this wonderful meme: my poetry is about Allah, not your ex-girlfriend. Next slide, please. And the screenwriter had the bright idea to cast Leonardo DiCaprio as Rumi in a film, which thankfully he turned down, so he's not cancelled. But I don't know who thought that was a great idea. Next slide, please. And then this atrocity is Rumi the musical, which I was stupid enough to go and watch in the West End, and it was awful, as I expected deep down. it was very much based on Alif Shafak's 40 Rules of Love, but I believe it was also based on another writer's weird interpretation of the Masnavi and the story of Maulana. But there was very odd dancing and really weird songs in there. I would not recommend. 0 stars. Next slide, please. And this is Alif Shafak. So 40 Rules of Love. Show of hands who's read 40 Rules of Love. I'm the first one. I'll give her one thing. It was the thing that got me interested in Maulana again. It was the opening. But after I read 40 Rules of Love, and I started to read more authentic work, and I started to work on my Persian, or I started to read Jawad Mujaddadi's translations and really trying to find more authentic work, is when I realized just how problematic 40 Rules of Love is. And to be honest, 40 Rules of Love, like, not only does she take complete creative license in the story of Maulana and Shams's meeting and Maulana's life and him as a person, the rules that she talks about there are no rules. Shams Tabrizi did not give Maulana any rules. It just fits into this really comfortable Western novel structure of here are the keys, to this wonderful mystical path. And the other thing that really bothered me was that the story that was intertwined with Maulana and Shams's story was about an American woman, I think, or she was an English woman. It was about a white woman who falls in love with this ethnically ambiguous man, and at no point do we understand their religion or whether Islam is even involved in the situation. It's just very much, a love story that has no place in the story of Maulana, basically. And she uses Coleman Barks' translations, amongst other weird translations that I don't know where she finds them from. And she says, I'm not a religious person at all, but I am interested in spirituality and mysticism and inner-oriented spiritual journeys all around the world. But then she chose this one to talk about. I don't know why she didn't choose a different spiritual journey. Next slide, please. So why Rumi and why now? Sorry, just 1 second. I think some of the pages on this haven't printed. Slight technical issue, just 1 second, sorry guys. Okay. So why is Rumi relevant now? There's a few theories that I'll throw about, and feel free to disagree with me. But the first one is that when initially Rumi came into the Western sphere, it was a time of people rejecting materialism and people rejecting, that post-war sentiment, and people were really discovering themselves, and they were trying to reject capitalism in a sense. So they were looking for something to fill that void, that spiritual void. And so they turned to the East, they found Maulana, they found lots of other Eastern traditions, and they tried to incorporate that to kind of get a sense of spiritual fulfillment. We're kind of in a place of spiritual crisis in the West today. We've had wars, we've had, lots of atrocities happening. And so people are returning to that place of questioning capitalism, questioning materialism, trying to find a sense of fulfillment, trying to find some spiritual, something to fill that spiritual void. But the way that we're going about it today is not correct. Not that it was right in the 60s, but the way that we're going about it today is by trying to sell spirituality. So things like selling hot yoga, which has no connection to Hinduism, or mass-produced Buddha statues, which has no connection to Buddhism. We're also trying to sell the essential Rumi, which has no connection to Maulana, no connection to Islam. It's almost like we're trying to sell the result without selling the method. So we're trying to tell people, here's a warm, fuzzy feeling through this quote, by Maulana, seek all the veils of love and remove them to reach God or some rubbish like that. But we're not giving people the essence of how Maulana reached that conclusion. How did Maulana get there? He got there through a very strict, regimented, spiritual process. He got through to that part, to where we want to get the end result. He got there by practicing something, by following a tariqah, by having a master, by having a teacher, by studying the Quran, by studying the religion. He didn't just decide to write a cute poem and then it made him happy and now you can do the same. But that's the way that these things are sold to us today. They're commercialized, they're packaged into cute, easy bite-sized things that we can just consume, that we can just purchase and keep on our shelves. I mean, I have at home, somebody gifted me Rumi tarot cards, which is wonderful, isn't it? Rumi tarot cards. I've never heard of anything more ridiculous. And of course, all the translations are Coleman Barks translations. And, some of them cite the source, which book of the Masnavi it's in. And I went and I looked into the Masnavi, and it's rubbish. It's not real. Like, they've just put some numbers like Masnavi, book 3, chapter 4. And it doesn't correlate with anything. So, and then there's instructions where you can bring a friend and shuffle these cards and lay them out and then count 4 and then count 3 and flip them over and it will tell you your future. And it's just ridiculous. That's how are you going to reach any sort of spiritual fulfillment through that? I mean, there is a tradition of bibliomancy within Iranian culture where people use the book of Divan Hafiz and they clear their intentions and they wish for something and they open it on a random page and they read the poem and it's supposed to give them some guidance in life. That is cultural. It's just a fun tradition. Like, nobody takes that seriously. Nobody goes and makes life decisions based on a little line of poetry from Hafiz. But this is on a completely different level. Tarot cards, which is foreign to Rumi's culture, is then, used to sell Maulana's poetry. It's ridiculous. I was going to bring them with me today, but I can't find them. It's the other theory that I would throw out there is that in the post 9/11 world, we as the diaspora, and I'm pointing to myself first and foremost, we were in such a space of identity crisis. And we were trying so hard to rebrand Islam and to prove ourselves, which we understand now was very naive. And it's not there's a quote that I really love, which says, "To humanize yourself is a dehumanizing act." So we were constantly trying to humanize ourselves because we've been otherized and dehumanized and excluded and marginalized. And we were constantly saying, "This is not us. We're not terrorists. We're not terrorists." And then, these cute translations of Coleman Barks comes out of somebody who's vaguely Muslim, and it's very tempting to cling on to that and go, yeah, oh my God, yeah, the guy that Leonardo DiCaprio wants to play in the movie, he's Muslim, because you just want to hold on to something and say, actually, this is us. And so we kind of just go along with it because, again, we accept breadcrumbs. We just go along with it because we just are so afraid of being branded as terrorists and being branded as and our whole spiritual and religious identity being hijacked by a fringe group of people. That's another theory, is that we've not, and I don't want to be accusatory, but we've kind of just gone along with it. And obviously for us who live in the diaspora, and for people who don't have, obviously I fully acknowledge that I'm privileged enough to be able to have some basic knowledge of Farsi, and that gives me a leg up. But for people who don't speak Farsi, didn't grow up knowing Maulana or reading Maulana, how are you to know that Coleman Barks is a mistranslation? How are you to know that this is fake? Right? You'll just think, oh, maybe he is talking about that. Maybe he is, And it's nice. You just think, okay, he's Muslim. Everybody likes him. He's the best-selling person in America, even though America regularly bombs Afghanistan and puts sanctions on Iran. But then a Persian man is the best-selling poet in that country, you just kind of go along with it because there's some shred of acceptance. And I'm definitely guilty of that myself when I first started learning about Rumi. The other thing is, I would say that we are, and I'm going to be a bit more positive now, we are having a bit of a revival of tasawwuf. And I think that's not just in the West amongst the diaspora, but it's also in the Islamic world in general. I mean, I'm part Iranian, part Iraqi, and I know that in Iraq, after the American invasion sort of ended and things started to settle, lots of groups of people started to go and, of the Qadiri tariqah, started to go and visit the shrines of I forgot his name. Abdul Qadir Jilani, thank you. Lots of people were going on pilgrimages, on ziyaras to the resting place of Jilani. So, there is a revival of tasawwuf that's happening. And I think also the younger generation is seeking something different than dogmatic interpretations of Islam. We're looking for something that aligns with our values. And what we're doing is not that we're finding something new, is that we're reviving a tradition that is deeply entrenched and deeply rooted within Islam. We're uncovering it again. We're bringing it back. So this revival of tasawwuf, and especially this particular interest in Maulana, is refreshing because it kind of signals this revival of a tradition that's been lost for some time, or has been sort of hidden for some time. The other thing is, some people would argue that there are relatable values in Maulana's poetry. So people can find values of tolerance and acceptance, which exist in Islam, but within Maulana's poetry, they're very sort of the focal point, and that's what draws them to them. So the idea of the concept of love being the all-encompassing power of the world, and the idea that love is the driving force of faith. That kind of sits well with people, and it's a value that people want to learn more about. There's the story of Moses and the shepherd, which I wanted to read to you, but it's not come up in my notes, unfortunately, so I can't access it. But basically, most people do know this story. It's where Moses goes out into a field and he finds a shepherd, and the shepherd is speaking to God as if he's speaking to a human being who's a lover. And he says to him, I wish I could sit with you. I wish I could brush your hair and hold your hand and clean your bed for you before you go to bed, and bring you some milk to drink before you sleep. And he's talking to God in this really intimate, personal way, as if he's talking to a human being. And Moses hears him, and his immediate reaction is he starts reprimanding him. He says to him, what are you doing? You're polluting the world with your kufr. You're polluting the world with this blasphemy. Before you've even become a Muslim in the sense that you've surrendered to God, not as in you've accepted Islam, because Moses' time Islam wasn't around. Before you've even become Muslim, you've committed kufr, you've committed idolatry. And he says to him, this isn't acceptable. And he goes on a whole rant for a few pages saying, you can't say this. You're talking to God as if he's a person. He's not a person. This is not how you do this, blah, blah. And the man says, I regret this so deeply. I'm so hurt. I'm burned, And he turns away, and he's completely despondent and heartbroken. And God immediately sends a revelation to Moses and says, I've sent you down as a prophet to connect people to me. How dare you separate them? And he says, he has come to me this way. You have no right to tell him how to worship me. You have no right to tell him how to connect to me. I've sent you as a prophet to connect people to me. And the interesting thing is, Maulana uses the hadith that's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, which says the thing that's most hated by God is divorce. He uses that here to say, as in, this is divorce. This is what's hated by God. And you've caused it. You've caused divorce between me and this person. So then Musa goes back to the shepherd and he says to him, look, Don't worry about adab. Don't worry about how to speak to God. Speak to Him however your heart desires. Speak to Him however your yearning heart desires. And it's just this concept that within the Masnavi, within Maulana's tradition of, the God of Moses is the God of Moses, and the God of the shepherd is the God of the shepherd, of, accepting people, meeting them where they are, and allowing them to have their own sort of connection with God in the way that they understand. Next slide, please. So we're just going to play a quick game of Rumi or not. I'm going to put up a quote, and if you can guess whether it's authentic Rumi or not, let's go. Please. Love puts away the instruments and takes off the silk robes. Our nakedness together changes me completely. Who says Rumi? Put your hand up. Oh, I've done well. Okay. Not Rumi. Okay.
Don't know.
You don't know, that's fine. Next slide, please. So that's not Rumi. The correct one is, he put harp and strings of silk on his lap. So you see how strings of silk has been interpreted as silk robes to kind of sexualize and fetishize, which is something that Orientalists have done for centuries with Islamic culture, and kept playing this song, I am happy and ecstatic. Next one, please. This night is not a night but a marriage, a couple whispering in bed in unison the same words. Darkness simply lets down a curtain for that. Who says Rumi?
Coleman Bark.
Who says not Rumi? Okay. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it's not. The correct one is, tonight is not a night, rather it is a wedding festival. So I should mention that the idea of wedding or ars in Tasawwuf, and especially where Maulana mentions it, is the union with God. It's the celebrating the union with God. So the day of his passing is actually celebrated as a wedding, because we acknowledge that he's reunited with his beloved. It is a wedding festival for those who seek God. It is an elegant companion for those who testify to God's unity. Tonight is a lovely veil of happiness for those with beautiful faces. Next, please. What you seek is seeking you. Who's read that one on a bumper sticker before? So, are we saying Rumi or not Rumi? Rumi? Okay. Anyone saying not Rumi? Okay, next, please. So not Rumi, I'm afraid. Next one. So this is my own translation. I hope it does it justice, but it's actually part of a longer poem which I really like, and so I wanted to put it in context. He actually says in that poem, where that is taken out of, is, so long as you are in search of treasure, that is what you are. So long as you crave a bite of bread, that is what you are. If you know the point of this secret, then you know. Whatever you seek, that is what you are. So it's actually saying you are what you seek, not what you seek is seeking you, or whatever that was. Next one, please. You say with the body, I am far, and with the heart, with the beloved. Rumi? I see a nod. Not Rumi? Okay, we don't have an opinion on this one? Okay, next. You think it's Rumi? Yeah, so it is. This one is actually a Rumi. An authentic translation of Rumi, I should say. Next one. So, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there.
So common.
Yeah, it's Rumi. Anyone saying not Rumi? Oh, I love the hands that shot up really, really high, really quickly. Next slide, please. So, sorry, go back a sec. So yeah, that's not Rumi. And actually, fun fact, Ivanka Trump tweeted this when her dad decided to pull the troops from Afghanistan. And that whole mess ensued in Afghanistan. She tweeted this, which I think is just perfect. Next one, please. It's actually beyond hearsay and faith, there's another place. We yearn for what's in the midst of that desert plain. When the Gnostic arrives there, he prostrates his face. There is no hearsay, faith, or place in that domain. You see here, the difference is there is some sort of pointing towards religion. He's talking about Gnostics. There's prostration. You can tell the man who wrote this has something to do with Islam. Even like, okay, you can't outright maybe tell that he's Muslim, but you know that he's maybe even been influenced by Islam. But there's a field out there, I'll meet you there. You're making plans with your friends. Like it doesn't have the same effect. Next one, please. I am not this hair, I am not this skin, I am the soul that lives within. Who thinks that's Rumi? Who thinks that's not Rumi? Okay, we're divided. Next. This is definitely not Rumi. Next slide, please. This is actually lyrics by India Ari, who I don't actually know. And she says, actually, that third slide was written by me. I'm tired of seeing this now. So it's another misattribution. What about this one? Today we're broken like every other day. Open not the door of worry, grab the lute and play. There are 100 kinds of prayers and prostrations when one faces their beloved's beauty as they pray. Who thinks Rumi? Okay. Who thinks not Rumi? You're saying not Rumi?
I have read it as Rumi, but it's wrong.
Okay. Next slide, please. This is actually correct. And because there's references to prayers and prostration, and there's some kind of Islamic theme. So it's your road and yours alone. Others may walk it with you, but no one can walk it for you. Who thinks Rumi? Who thinks not Rumi? Okay. Next. Yeah, so it's not. Actually, if you just go back a second, this quote is a proverb by Native Americans. So whoever's attributed that to Rumi has appropriated their culture as well. Next one, please. So not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the east or the west, not out of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. Who thinks that's Rumi? Who thinks it's not Rumi? Okay, next please. It's definitely not Rumi, because in Rumi's time I don't think that the idea of the Zen had reached that part of the world, first of all. And then we also didn't have the idea of cultural systems, which is a really odd thing to put in an old poem, whoever attributed this to Rumi. And also I don't think Rumi would ever outright say, I'm not a Muslim, when he's a Muslim scholar. That would be ridiculous. Next one, please. If I live, I'm the Quran's servant evermore. I'm the dirt of Muhammad, the chosen one's door. If someone attributes to me anything more, both the person and what they have said, I abhor. And that's definitely Rumi. And it's quite sad to read this, because it's almost as if he knew that his work would be bastardized one day, and that people would misattribute work to him, and he had the wisdom to kind of preempt that. Next, please. And I'll just leave you with this. A wretch steals the words Sufi spoke and tells tall tales to simple folk. The work of real men shines bright. The vile have shameless tricks, not light. And that is by Maulana Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi from the Masnavi, Book 1, Part 11. You can go look it up. Thank you very much. Should I take some questions? Yes.
Can I just say, mashallah, beautiful talk.
Oh, thank you.
Personally, for me, what I'm getting from all of this is that what happened in the 60s was the great secular experiment failed on two counts. One was no sense of the ancient sacred, and the second sense was no sense of wisdom. Secularism is not the only wisdom. So what they did with Rumi, they turned him into Confucius. Confucius was not believe in God. There were always lovely and wise, ancient, sage kind of sayings.
Yeah.
And they locked Islam by using Rumi.
Yeah.
That's fine.
It's a brilliant point. I don't know if everybody heard what the sister said, but it's basically that they turned in the 60s. You were saying that they turned Rumi into Confucius, and Confucius did not adhere to any religion. And I think that I completely am on board with that. I mean, it's a theft, isn't it? It's a theft of our collective intellectual property. It's a theft of our cultural and spiritual identity, and it's one of the worst thefts that happened during colonialism. It's not the theft of resources; it's the theft of our spirit that's most troubling. And to see Rumi then regurgitated and returned to the Middle East in this form, in the Western form, from the Western gaze, is what's really troubling. And I think that's why I was making a point of us having to reclaim Rumi, and us having to be really conscious of anything that we read that's attributed to him, and to really actually, just as we take the time to learn the hadith and to read the Quran, and I don't want to draw too many comparisons between the Quran and the Masnavi, astaghfirullah, but we also need to learn about Maulana and his work. We need to actually give the Masnavi its time and read it properly to kind of undo these years of criminal behavior. Any other questions? Yeah. I'm going to pass the mic to you. I think it's better. Thank you.
Yes, I've been reading the Jawad Mujadali's translation. I've found it fascinating. I follow the same people that you follow. One of the things I've struggled with is trying to adequately interpret and understand the work. So during your talk, you've explained sections of the book which have gone straight over my head several times over. My question for you is, how do you read appropriately? How do you read with nuance? Is this something you study? What would you recommend to try and get the most out of Rumi?
Good question.
A long journey.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I haven't done any formal study. I've just read as much as I can on my own. So I would definitely highly recommend Persian Poetics, Muhammad Ali Majardi. He does really brilliant courses. And they're on Zoom because he's based in Iran now. And he really dissects the poetry really well. And he reads nuance into it. But I think the more you learn about the concepts within Tasawwuf, so for example, learning that Layla is a metaphor for God, Phoenix is a metaphor for God, the more you learn these things, then when you come to read it, you kind of already have that background. So you already, when the Phoenix comes up, you're like, I know. The other thing is having a good understanding of the Quran. So you start with the Quran and then you come into Rumi, because he bases everything on the Quran. So if I didn't know the story of Moses, I wouldn't know what he's talking about in that story of Moses and the shepherd. If I didn't, because in that story, the real important thing to remember is that Moses is a prophet of intellect. He came down with laws and rules. So for him to see somebody speaking to God in that way, it's really odd. And you kind of, when you come into it, then you realize, you're like, oh, but this is Moses. It's not any other prophet. Do you know? It's Moses, so of course he's going to take this really badly. But I think having a good, and I'm not saying that I have a super good understanding of the Quran, but having a good understanding of the stories in the Quran kind of helps you understand, because the Masnavi is very much a reflection of the Quran. And even the way that the chapters are divided, and even the way that you read the Masnavi, the structure is very similar to the Quran. So it's not one long epic. It's not like the Conference of the Birds, which is just one long poem. It's lots of different stories, and the point of them is the message. And it's stories with a strong divine spiritual message at the end. And the Quran is similar. The Quran doesn't give you a long narrative of, what Joseph did and what he wore and how he ate and where exactly he was living and, who every member of his family was and what they did. It just gives you a brief. He says, remember Joseph? Remember when this happened to him? This is what can happen. This is da-da-da-da-da. And Rumi does the same thing. He copies that structure. He goes, remember when this happened? This is what God is trying to tell you. So it's kind of approaching it in that way, but I would highly recommend the courses by Persian Poetics. That's the one that I did that really helped me. Does anyone else have any other questions? Yeah? Sorry.
Just wanted to thank you, really. Thank you so much. It's really insightful. I think we all go into this trapped sometimes. If you're interested in poetry, then you read quotes and you get Coleman Bark is selling, and it just also shows about decolonizing things, isn't it? And for us as well, not acknowledging our own and not validating the work which is done by black and brown and all other people as well. So I just wanted to really also ask you if there's a way how we can introduce it to children. Because
I have a good recommendation.
It can be really difficult and really burdensome, you know, when you go into the classic Masnavi and you don't know much about the language as well. So how do you, are there any recommendations?
Yeah, there is a recommendation. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. I'm glad that you found it helpful, and I'm in the same place as you. The reason that I know this much is because I started where you've started, you know. I started by reading, you know, Out There is a Field and all that, and getting that warm fuzzy feeling and going, oh my God, he's Muslim, and fangirling. But then, you know, it was embarrassing for me because I'm Iranian. But yeah, I would highly recommend, there is a book called Sufi Comics, and the same authors have released a book of Rumi stories. I can't remember the name of the authors. They're two brothers. They're based in Pakistan or India, I think Pakistan. And yeah, I found that book really interesting. It was just bite-sized and easy to read. It's really good for children. It's got lots of pictures, and not for children. I have it on my Kindle. Like, it's just really good. I would highly, highly recommend that as a way to introduce Rumi to children. But you can come back and speak to me later, and I'll give you the full name. Yeah, sure. Does anyone else have any questions or anything else? Yeah.
Thank you for your report. I just have a question around how, because a lot of other poets were inspired by Rumi, as I've started to read around the other poets of the time he came after. Is there any way or any recommendations of books that you might have that kind of follows that journey of like from teacher to teacher? Because when you start reading the poems, you can see he's been inspired by what. Is there like a good book that you could recommend that shows that transition?
Thank you. I can't think of a book. Do you mean a book that is similar in that it shows like a teacher-master narrative, or a book that follows on from Rumi, like a...
I guess
both. The first one. For me personally, I can't think of another poet that has quite been inspired by their master to the point where they name an entire divan of poetry, you know, after them. So Maulana wrote a whole collection of poetry called Divan-e-Shams, which is dedicated to Shams Tabrizi, and I can't think of any other Sufi sages. That wasn't your question?
No, sorry.
No.
I meant more that they were inspired by the work.
Oh, the work of Maulana and Shams?
Yeah, rather than the
Right,
actual
okay. So, to be honest, I can't think of a book, but Persian culture in general has been deeply inspired by Maulana. You'll find like quotes of Maulana's poetry in pop songs, you know, at weddings, and people quote him just off the cuff. But if you're interested in Iranian cinema, there are good Iranian films that use a lot of the themes that are common in Maulana's work. So I think there are some, you know, beautifully poetic cinematic works of art in Iranian cinema that you could watch that also reflect Maulana's work. I would highly recommend a film called Baba Aziz. I think some people already know it because it's quite famous, but it basically tracks the journey of a Sufi and his granddaughter, I believe, across Morocco and Turkey and Iran, and it's really beautiful. And a lot of the themes in that film are about the same things that Maulana teaches, and I think it's definitely inspired by the Masnavi, definitely inspired by Maulana's work. Anybody else? Yeah?
Jazakallah you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed all of it. I just wanted to ask, I realise there isn't much information that I personally know about Shams al-Tabrizi. Are there any sources or books that you recommend reading about him more?
Good question. Thank you. So Shams is a bit of an enigma. He's described as a wandering dervish. So we don't know, we know that he's Shams al-Tabrizi, so he's probably from Tabriz. But there isn't much else about him other than what Maulana has written about him. And what Maulana has written about him is about how much he loves him and about his wonderfulness and about what he taught him. But concrete facts about Shams are really difficult to find because Shams did not want to be found. Do you know? Shams was somebody who wandered, somebody who didn't have a stable place and didn't have like an internet presence. Do you know what I mean? So it's quite hard to like pinpoint facts about him to the point where some Orientalists have contemplated whether Shams was a figment of Rumi's imagination, which of course he was not, but it's to that extent of we don't have a lot of information about Shams Tabrizi, unfortunately. Maybe you can, I don't know, I can do a bit of research and see, but I highly doubt I'd find anything. Does anyone else have any questions? No? I think good. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening so intensely and being wonderful.